Letter 9. Why so few revivals? I am rejoiced to perceive that the inquiry is beginning to agitate the Church. Why are there not more revivals? As well as, why is their character so changed? The inquiry is also made, what can be done to promote them, and to promote them under a desirable and permanent type? Now, my dear brethren, I hope and trust that you will not be offended with me if I speak my mind on this subject with great plainness. The circumstances of the Church, the decline of revivals, and the whole aspect of the Christian world demand it. I have seen in the public papers various reasons assigning for this declension of revival, this absence of revival influence, this powerless preaching of the gospel. Now it appears to me that we who are ministers, instead of looking abroad and searching for the fundamental difficulty beyond and out of ourselves, should see that whatever else may be an occasion of the great falling off and decline in revivals, our own spiritual state is certainly one, if not the primary and fundamental reason of this decline. Want of personal holiness, unction, power in prayer, and in preaching the word, the want of holy living and consecration to the work of self-denial and energetic effort in the ministry, these, no doubt, are the principal reasons why revivals are so few and far between, and of so superficial character at the present day. The fact is, ministers have turned aside, in a great degree, to vain janglings, have given up their attention to church politics, church government, and ecclesiastical proceedings of various kinds. The ministers have been diverted to an alarming and most injurious extent from promoting revivals of religion out of the Church and holiness in the Church. I appeal to you, my brethren, of all denominations, if it is not a fact in your own experience and observation, that ministers have to a great and alarming extent suffered themselves to be diverted from the direct work of promoting the conversion of sinners and sanctification of the Church. This is too notorious to need proof. The journals of the day, the movements of ecclesiastical bodies, the doctrinal collisions and, shall I say, ambitious projects that have come up and figured before the public within the last few years, bear no dubious testimony to the fact that the great mass of ministers are turned aside from promoting revivals and the holiness and entire consecration of the Church. Now, my beloved brethren, while this is so, does it not become us to take this home, confess it, bewail it, and first of all understand that whatever else needs to be corrected and set right, we must ourselves repent and receive a new unction for the work? Beloved brethren, it is of no use for us to go abroad and search for reasons, while the principle of all the reasons lies at our own door. While our hearts are cold, our zeal in revivals abated, while we are turned aside and running here and there to attend conventions, councils, ecclesiastical bodies, while we are engaged in reading the vituperative publications of the day, and entering into church politics and jangling about church government and all these things, it is no wonder that both the Church and the world are asleep on the subject of revivals. Until the leaders enter into the work, until the ministry are baptized with the Holy Spirit, until we are awake and in the field with our armor on and our souls anointed with the Holy Spirit, it certainly ill becomes us to be looking around at a distance for the cause of the decline of revivals. I have no doubt that there are many causes which, the Lord willing, we will search out, but this is the first, the greatest, the most God-dishonoring of all, that the ministry are not in the work, that the shepherds have in a measure forsaken their flock, that is, they are not leading them into the green pastures and besides the still waters, are not themselves so anointed and full of faith and power as to be instrumental in leading the Church into the field for the promotion of revivals. To a considerable extent, the Church seems not to be well aware of the state of the ministry, and for the reason that they themselves are in a state of decline. The decline of vital godliness in the ministry has been, of course, the occasion of so much decline in the Church, that they are hardly aware of their own state or of the spiritual state of the ministry, Now, my brethren, I hope it will not be said that by writing in this way I am letting down the influence of the ministry and encouraging a fault-finding spirit in the church. I would by no means do this, but I think that we may rest assured that, unless we are frank enough and humble enough and honest enough to look the true state of things in the face, confess, forsake our sins, and return to the work and engage in the promotion of revivals, God will undoubtedly rebuke us, and will raise other instruments to do his work, and set us aside, will alienate the heart of the churches from us, destroy our influence with them, and raise up, we know not whom, to go forth and possess the land. Among all the conventions of the present day, I have thought that one of a different character from any that have been might be greatly useful. If we could have a ministerial convention for prayer, confessing our faults one to another, and getting into a revival spirit, and devising the best ways and means for the universal promotion of revivals throughout the length and breadth of the land, I should rejoice in it. It has appeared to me that of all the conventions of the day, one of this kind might be the most useful. What shall we say, brethren? Are we not greatly in fault? Have not the ministry to a great extent lost the spirit of revivals? Is there not a great lack of unction and power amongst us? And we have not suffered ourselves to be greatly and criminally diverted from this great work? If so, my dear brethren, shall we not return? Shall we not see our fault, confess it to the churches, to the world, and return, and in the name of the Lord lift up our banner? I hope my brethren will bear with me, while I further insist on the general delinquency of ministers, especially of late, in regard to revivals. There has been so manifest and so lamentable a falling off from a revival spirit among the ministers of Christ, as to become a matter of general, if not universal, observation. Nothing is more common than the remark that ministers, as a general fact, have lost the spirit of revivals, have become very zealous in ecclesiastical matters, censorious, afraid of revivals, of revival men and measures, and that they do little or nothing directly for the promotion of revivals of religion. Now, I do not think that this is a universal fact, but as a general remark it is too obvious to need proof, and I think must be conceded by all. Now, dearly beloved brethren, unless there is a spirit of revival in the ministry, it is in vain to expect it in the church. The proper place for the shepherd is before or in advance of the sheep. The sheep will follow him whithersoever he goes, but if he attempt to drive them before him, he will scatter them in every direction. If the shepherd fall away from a revival spirit, the sheep will naturally decline also. If he advance in the work of the Lord, they will almost as a thing of course follow him wherever he leads. The greatest of all difficulties in the way of the promotion of revivals has been a superficial work of grace in the hearts of ministers themselves. If this is not true, I am greatly mistaken. My brethren, believe me, I speak not this censoriously or in the spirit of fault-finding. It is the full and deliberate conviction of my mind, an opinion formed, not hastily, but from protracted observation, and from an intimate acquaintance with great numbers of the ministers of Christ of different denominations. While the ministers of Christ are filled with the Spirit of God, the church, as a general thing, will not backslide. I say as a general thing. There may, in some instances, be influences brought to bear on the churches that will divert them from the promotion of holiness in their own hearts and the conversion of the impenitent, in spite of all that the most wakeful and vigilant ministry can do. Great political excitements, great commercial embarrassments, great depressions or elevations in the business and pecuniary state of the church or the world may, in a great measure, divert the mass of professors of religion for a time from deep spirituality, although the ministers may be awake. And yet it is my deliberate opinion that a thoroughly wakeful, prayerful, energetic ministry by their influence would generally, if not universally, prevent all the calamities and disturbances by so deeply engaging the church and the community in general on religious subjects that war, great political excitements, great commercial excitements, speculations or embarrassments would not be likely to occur. However this may be, I cannot believe it to be otherwise than a general truth that if the ministry are baptized with the Holy Spirit and deeply anointed with the revival influence, so the church will be, like priest, like people. And now, brethren, it does seem to me that when we ourselves are thoroughly in a revival spirit, our call to the churches to arise and engage in the general promotion of revivals will be immediately responded to on the part of the church. Let the ministry only come out in the true spirit of revivals, and I doubt whether any minister in the land can preach for 3 Sabbaths in his church in the Spirit without finding the spirit of revival waking up in the church. Let this experiment once be tried. Let us wake up to the importance of this subject, confess and forsake our sins and cry aloud to the church, and spare not. Let us lift up our voice like a trumpet and rally the host of God's elect, and if they are deaf to the call, then let us inquire most earnestly what is next to be done. But until we are anointed to the work, do not let us tempt the Lord or abuse the church by looking out of ourselves and away from ourselves for the cause of decline in revivals. Do not misunderstand me. I know that the church is in a state of decline and needs greatly to be quickened and aroused, but I am confident that the prime cause of this decline in the church is to be found in the fact that the ministers have been diverted from their appropriate work, and I am also confident that the only remedy for this state of things is, first and foremost of all, for ministers to come into a deep spiritual and revived state of mind, and as soon as this comes to pass, there will be a general revival, and I am not looking for it to come unless ministers do thoroughly wake up to their own state and the state of the church. Letter 10. Causes of the decline of revivals. Another cause of the decline of revivals, in my estimation, is that a right course has not been pursued with the churches. In some instances they have been urged to labor and visit and put forth active efforts for the conversion of sinners, while they have had very little wholesome food to live upon. Much labor has been demanded with too spare a diet. They have heard very little else than mere legal preaching. Ministers have been preaching almost exclusively to the impenitent, and perhaps for months have given the church scarcely one wholesome meal of the real gospel. If Christians are to labor for God and souls, they must be fed with the plenty of bread that comes down from heaven. They must be made to know and feel where their great strength lies, must have Christ in all his offices and relations and fullness frequently presented to them. If this course is not pursued, their own piety will not only greatly suffer, but they will come into a legal spirit, and all their efforts for the conversion of sinners will be only bustle and legality, and in this state they may encompass sea and land to make proselytes and fill the church with spurious converts. If I am not entirely mistaken, this has been, to an alarming extent, the fact in revivals that have prevailed within the last few years. Christians have had so little of the gospel that they have become legal, self-righteous, blustering, carnal, mechanical, unbelieving, and their efforts have made converts like themselves, which has brought revivals into great disrepute. Again, ministers, by preaching too exclusively to the impenitent, and dwelling so little on the marrow and fatness and fullness of the gospel, have greatly suffered in their own piety, have themselves become, in many instances, legal, hard-hearted, and censorious. In this state, they cannot promote true revivals of religion. Not living themselves on Christ, not dwelling in God and God in them, they are in no state to feed the church or promote true and thorough revivals of religion. Again, there has been so great a fear of antinomianism among ministers for the last few years that I fear they have greatly neglected to hold up the real fullness and perfection of present gospel salvation. Many of them have been misled entirely by false statements that have been made in respect to antinomianism in the public journals which they take and read. I have been astonished as I have been abroad, to find how much misinformation was afloat in regard to the real views which we have here entertained and inculcated, and the results of exhibiting our views to this and other churches. This misinformation has led many great ministers to feel it necessary to guard their people strongly against error in this direction, and in exposing what they have supposed to be the errors of perfectionists and sanctificationists, they have practically greatly lowered the standard of gospel holiness in their own churches. I mean, this has been the practical result. Preaching against the doctrine of entire sanctification in this life, and holding out the idea, as many have, that Christians are expected to sin as long as they live, the practical result has been a perpetual backsliding on the part of their churches. Prejudice has been created against the doctrine of sanctification in the church, and, if I am not mistaken, ministers have greatly suffered in their own piety in consequence of this course, and a consequent and corresponding descent in spirituality has been manifest in their churches. I am fully persuaded that my brethren in the ministry will find it indispensable to insist on entire holiness of heart and life as a practical attainment in this world, or they can never sustain a healthy piety in their churches. My dear brethren, you may try it as long as you will, but if you take any lower ground than this, your churches will backslide until you yourselves will be appalled by the result. I am perfectly satisfied from long experience that there is no other way but to lodge the deep impression in the churches that they are not only required but expected to cleanse themselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God, and pleading for sin, or anything that has a practical tendency of denying the practicability of attaining this state in this life, is the greatest and most ruinous error that can be inculcated on the churches. As said an English writer not long since, no error is so destructive and to be so greatly denounced as that Christians are expected to sin during this life. My beloved brethren, in what I now say I am not endeavoring to win you to my opinion, but I wish to fix your attention and the attention of the church on the fact, and to have you witness the results of incalculating any lower practical standard than that which I have named. The fact is, the churches are going rapidly away from God for want of the true bread of life, and because the ministry have, to such an alarming extent, been guarding their churches more against the doctrines of sanctification than they have against sin. I beseech my brethren to adopt a different course, and urge the church right up to holy living, and let them know that they are expected to obey the law and the gospel of God. Try it, brethren, and you will find it to be life from the dead to your churches. Do not be afraid of antinomian perfectionism. It is not to me at all wonderful that, at first, the true doctrines of sanctification and antinomianism should be confounded in many minds, and that the defenders of the one should be confounded with the defenders of the other. But, beloved brethren, is it not time for ministers to understand, as clear as sunlight, the distinction between the two, and no longer be prejudiced or alarmed themselves, and no longer prejudice and alarm the church by confounding things that so entirely differ? I hope in what I now say I shall not arouse the prejudice of my brethren, so that they will not further hear me in what I have to say in regard to the errors that have prevailed in the promotion of revivals of religion, and in regard to the causes that have operated to make them so few and far between, and of so superficial a character. My dear brethren, my heart is full of this subject, and I have a great deal to say. I beg of you to hear me patiently and inquire honestly whether there has not been a great error in the direction that I have just named. Another thing that has acted very injuriously to the interests of revivals of religion is the false views that have prevailed in relation to the best means of promoting them. And in respect to means, I have not been mistaken, there is a strong tendency to two opposite and almost equally injurious extremes. On the one hand, many seem to be expecting to promote revivals without the use of any special means whatever, Since revivals are the work of God, they think it enough to follow their ordinary Sabbath exercises with their regular weekly or monthly lectures, occasional prayer meetings, etc., and leave the event, as they say, with the sovereignty of God, believing these means to be sufficient, or that God can work just as well without any means whatever. They think it would be equivalent to taking the work out of the hand of God and attempting to promote revivals in our own strength, to make any other efforts than the ordinary Sabbath exercises to promote the salvation of souls. Now it appears to me that there is one principle of human nature here overlooked, which must be regarded if we would successfully promote the kingdom of God. When any one mind or any number of minds are excited upon any topic, if you would gain their attention to any other subject, you must use means which are, in their nature, calculated to interest and excite them. Now the whole nominally Christian world are, and have been for the last 30 years, in a state of excitement, tending to a great moral revolution. By moral revolution, I mean the revolution of opinion, and the consequent revolution of practice. Reform is the order of the day, and many questions of deep interest are arising, one after another, to agitate the public mind, and the providence of God is pressing the whole mass of mind with agitating questions, and producing just as much excitement as may be healthfully borne. These questions are political and religious. Indeed, there is scarcely any subject of deep and fundamental interest to mankind that has not its own advocates, lectures, and public journals, through which it interests and excites the public mind. Now, it is perfectly unphilosophical to expect to so gain upon the attention of mankind as to promote revivals of religion without making extra and protracted efforts. As the world is using steam power to promote political agitation and reform, the ministry must lift up their voices like a trumpet, cry aloud and spare not, and must multiply their efforts and their means in proportion to the excited state of the world on its topics, until by the blessing of God they gain the attention and keep it until the heart is subdued to God. It may be true that in those places where excitement upon other subjects but little prevails, revivals may be promoted without extra efforts. But if the Church is expecting to promote revivals without great, powerful and protracted efforts, they will find themselves mistaken. The fact that revivals are the work of God, instead of affording a reason for neglecting efforts, is the very reason which renders them indispensable. God does not subvert, but strictly adheres to the laws of mind in building up His kingdom and establishing His government in this world. For us, therefore, to plod on, and fear to use extra and exciting efforts to promote revivals of religion, while the world is all excitement on other subjects, is unphilosophical and absurd. It is true that great wisdom is needed to guard against indiscretion and means of an unnecessary agitating and exciting character, and means that will rather divert attention from the truth than secure attention to the truth. But means must be used, meetings must be multiplied, preachers and Christians must be themselves excited, and must be able to lift their voices above the winds and waves of this world's excitements, until they rivet attention, or they can never sanctify the heart. Letter 11. The Impolicy of Spasmodic Efforts. Before I proceed further on the subject of my last letter, I wish to call the attention of the brethren to an evil which seems to me to have greatly grieved the Spirit of God, and to be at present a very effectual barrier to the promotion of revivals of religion. I have already alluded to it in a former letter, but wish more distinctly to dwell on it here. The evil to which I allude is this: an amount of prejudice has been excited against revival men and measures that has greatly grieved the Spirit of God. It does not seem to me to have been sufficiently considered that a mind under the influence of prejudice cannot have communion with God, and consequently cannot prevail in prayer, cannot appropriate the grace that is essential to our living in such a manner as to honor God. Now it cannot be denied that a course has been taken that has filled the Church, throughout the length and breadth of the land, with a variety of prejudices that are eating out the piety of the churches and preventing the promotion of revivals. Ministers have, in many instances, doubtless without designing such a result, been instrumental in creating prejudices in the minds of their churches that have shut them out from communion with God. They are in an uncandid state of mind. They are committed and unwilling to hear with both ears and then judge. Their prejudices extend to a great many subjects in some churches. Great prejudices are excited in the cause of abolition, moral reform, revival men and measures, protracted meetings, new and old school theology, sanctification, or anti-sanctification. Now it matters little what the prejudices are in favor of what is really truth or against it. If they be really prejudices and the mind be committed, and in an uncandid state, it effectually shuts the soul out from God. Prejudice is prejudicing a question. And prejudgment is what Christ intended to prohibit and forbid. He did not design to teach that we should have no decided opinion and form no unwavering judgment in respect to cases, questions, and characters on which we may be called to decide, but that we should not judge without a candid, thorough, and charitable examination in every case. Now, ministers of a certain combative temperament are, without being aware of it, doing little else than preaching their people into the exercise of a host of prejudices that promote anything but their real piety. I have been shocked oftentimes on witnessing the prejudice evinced by ministers themselves and by professors of all denominations. Now, brethren, if we would promote revivals of religion among our people, we must fear to excite prejudices among them on any subject. They are naturally enough prone to prejudices, to rush into one-sided judgments without our helping them into this ungodly state of mind by our preaching. If we come out and warn them against this thing and that thing and the other thing, denounce anti-slavery, moral reform, or even colonialization, or anything else, in a spirit and manner that creates prejudice, we may think ourselves doing God's service and may please ourselves when we behold our people very zealous for what we suppose to be truth. We may form and guard their orthodoxy until they have zeal enough to encompass sea and land to make proselytes to their opinions. And when we have done, we shall perceive that they are only making their converts twofold more the children of hell than themselves. There is another class of Christians than those to whom I referred in my last, that seem to me to have fallen into error opposed to that of which I then spoke. This class, instead of taking the ground that no extra means are to be used for the conversion of sinners and the sanctification of the church, seem to have settled down in the belief that nothing can be done without protracted meetings and the most exciting meetings that can be used. Hence they seem to be for doing up all their religious work in protracted meetings, giving up nearly their whole time to protracted effort, or a series of meetings, during a small part of each year, and making little or no effort to sustain the interest of religion, promote the conversion of sinners and the sanctification of the church at other seasons. Now it seems to me that this class of persons as radically misconceive the proper and only healthful method of promoting religion as that class of Christians do to whom they stand opposed. Now that a series of meetings continued for days and weeks may be useful, and in some instances demanded by the state of things, I think there can be no reasonable doubt. But as a general thing, it seems to me that it would be more healthful for religion to have meetings for preaching and prayer and promoting the spirituality of Christians so frequently at all seasons of the year as to secure the attention of the people, and yet so infrequently as not to disturb their ordinary, or to say the least, their necessary duties in the relations which they sustain. When I was first acquainted with revivals of religion, my own practice was this, and, so far as I know, it was the general practice of ministers and churches which endeavored to promote revivals of religion. We added to the services of the Sabbath as many meetings during the week as could well be attended, and yet allow the people to carry forward their necessary worldly business, and we went no further than this. I have seen most powerful revivals of religion in the midst of harvest in a neighborhood of farmers, and found that it could be sustained by holding as many meetings as were consistent with farmers securing their crops, and no more. The grand error which seems to me to have prevailed for the last few years is this: churches that are attempting to promote revivals break in for a time on all the ordinary and necessary duties of domestic, commercial, agricultural, and mechanical life, and make every day a Sabbath for a great number of days in succession, and then it seems to be necessary to hold no meetings for a long time except on the Sabbath. They have neglected their worldly business so much and so long that now they must make as much extra effort to bring up the arrears in that department as they have made in their protracted meeting to bring up the arrears in the spiritual department. They go from one extreme to another, from holding meetings every day in the week to holding meetings on which there is anything like a general attendance no day in the week, from going to meeting nearly all the time until they have greatly neglected their worldly business. They break off and go to meeting at any time except on the Sabbath. Now it does seem to me that this is entirely unwise, and that its results are demonstrating to the churches that the action of this course of things is not healthful, and that a better course would be to keep up as many meetings at all seasons of the year as can be sustained, and yet the necessary secular business transacted. As excitement increases on other subjects, we shall find it necessary in the same proportion to increase the frequency and urgency of our appeals to mankind on the great subject of salvation. As I said in my last, if worldly men increase the means of exciting the people on worldly subjects, we must at least in equal proportion multiply the means for securing the attention of men to spiritual subjects. This seems to me to be a law of mind, and instead of this being set aside by the fact that revivals are produced by the Spirit of God, and instead of its being thereby rendered unnecessary to multiply means, inasmuch as means are essential to the Spirit's work, they must be multiplied if we expect divine influence to produce the desired result. Ministers have perceived with pain that through the instrumentality of protracted meetings, the churches are taken on more and more the type of a spasmodic and temporary excitement on the subject of revivals, seizing on those seasons of the year when they have but little else to do, or neglecting whatever they have to do, and giving themselves up to a protracted effort, going to meetings day and night for a few days or weeks, and then relapsing to no effort. Whereas the churches should make a steady effort and put forth their energies every day to secure the attention of people in proportion to the exciting topics on other subjects that are so pressed on them by worldly men and worldly influences to endanger their very souls. Letter 12. Hindrances to a Revival Spirit. Another thing that is working an immense evil at present is the growing sectarianism of the Church. It seems to me that the leading denominations that have heretofore been most zealous and successful in promoting revivals of religion are, within the last 10 years, becoming highly sectarian in their spirit and measures. The collision and sectarianism manifested by their former leading denominations does not, I should think, increase its degree of virulence, but these leading denominations are becoming divided amongst themselves, and seem to be very much given up to the spirit of schism and sectarianism. There is high church and low church, old school and new school, reformers and conservatives, in all the denominations, and there seems to be pressing their peculiarities in a spirit and by measures that are highly sectarian. Sectarian conventions, ecclesiastical meetings, councils, synods, and all the parade and paraphernalia of sectarianism seem to an alarming extent to be engrossing the mind of the Church. Now this is certainly a great evil, and unless a counteracting influence can be brought to bear on the churches, unless ministers cease from this sectarian spirit, Cease from these janglings and strife of words. Cease from creating prejudices. Cease from heresy hunting and all the management of ecclesiastical ambition, and give themselves up directly to promoting brotherly love, harmony in the church, the conversion of sinners and the sanctification of saints. It is certain that revivals of religion cannot exist, neither go forward in purity and power. What is peculiarly affecting in view of this state of things is that ministers and many Christians have become so thoroughly sectarian and are so thoroughly and deeply imbued with the spirit of sectarianism as to be wholly unconscious that they are sectarian. They seem to suppose that it is a pure love of the truth, that they are only contending earnestly for the faith once delivered to the saints, that they are really and only jealous for the honor of God and the purity of the church. They have exalted their peculiar views in their own estimation into fundamental doctrines, and contend for them with as much pertinacity and vehemence as if all must be reprobates who do not embrace them. Now it is remarkable that, so far as my knowledge extends, all the seasons of great revivals with which the church has been blessed from the very first have been broken up, and the revival influence set aside by an ecclesiastical and sectarian janglings, to preserve what they call the purity of the church and the faith once delivered to the saints. I believe it to be a truth that ministers as a class have always been responsible for the decline of revivals, that their own sectarianism, ambition, and prejudice have led them to preach and contend, to run synods, councils, and other ecclesiastical meetings, until the church, at first pained and even shocked with this tendency of things, have come to adopt their views, imbibe their spirit, and get entirely away from God. My beloved brethren, who does not know that a vast many ministers are too much under the influence of prejudice to have communion and power with God? Who does not know that they are not sufficiently honest, uncommitted, upright, wholehearted lovers of truth to be thoroughly open to conviction on every subject, willing to examine patiently and to judge charitably on every question on which they are to have or give an opinion? I have in my own experience learned that, to maintain communion with God, I must wholly give up prejudice on every subject. I must hold my mind open to conviction. I must be thoroughly a candid and honest man. I must not allow myself to have or express an opinion on a subject that I have not carefully and prayerfully examined. There are many in these days that seem to have forgotten what God has to say of those that speak evil of things they understand not. And it is amazing to see what an extent both ministers and professed Christians are given up to denouncing and speaking evil of things which they do not understand. Now these ministers and Christians cannot pray. God will not hear them. They do not prevail with God, and everybody sees that they do not. They are not men that have power with God and with men, and can prevail. They will denounce certain doctrines and certain things in a manner that is unutterably shocking to those who certainly know that they do not understand what they are talking about, who know that they are confounding things that radically differ and making distinctions where there is no difference. Now I might mention a great many facts and illustrations of this, but almost everyone is aware that it has been, and still is, perfectly common for ministers and private Christians to persist in confounding the views of entire sanctification, which are entertained here, with antinomian perfectionism. Now certainly those who do this either do not mean what they say, or they have not well examined the subject. They are speaking of what they do not know, and speaking evil of things that they understand not. Now, my beloved brethren, I say not this to reproach anyone, but who does not know after all that this is true, or at least who may not know that it is true? Now, whether our peculiar views are true or false, it is wholly unfair to confound them with views which we abhor as much as do these ministers, though they fail to distinguish between the two. Now, if our views are untrue, let them be examined and stand or fall on their own merits. It may be convenient for those who oppose them to confound them with antinomian perfectionism, or with popery, or with universalism, or with any other ism that will attach to them so much opprobrium as to make the Church unwilling ever to examine them for themselves. But let me say to my dear brethren that, whether our views are true or false, that way of disposing of them is certainly to bring leanness to your own souls and into the souls of your churches. And I ask of you, brethren, if it is not, as a matter of fact, producing this result, when you have been engaged in denouncing our views, or confounding them with antinomianism, or persecuting them in ecclesiastical meetings, or in any way engaged in creating prejudices in opposition to them, I beseech you to consider, have you not found that this was bringing leanness into your own souls, that you were less spiritual minded, had less communion with God, less heart to preach the gospel, less unction in preaching, and more of a sectarian spirit? My beloved brethren, will you, ministers as well as laymen, candidly settle this question by laying open your heart at the throne of grace before the Lord? Letter 13. Objections to protracted meetings. I designed to have prepared a letter for insertion, previous to the one which appeared in the last paper, continuing my remarks on the subject of the use of means to promote revivals. I had said that there were two extremes, and that some were expecting to promote revivals only through the influence of protracted meetings and continuous efforts of that kind, while others were opposed to all such efforts. I also animadverted somewhat upon the tendency of certain Christians to compress nearly all their efforts for the promotion of religion into a few days and weeks of the year, when they have little else to do, and do little or nothing for those objects at any other season of the year. After I had finished that letter, it occurred to me that it was liable to misapprehension, and, as I said, I had designed to prepare the remarks which I now intend to make, to follow that letter immediately. But as the one which appeared in your last was previously written, it has appeared without my fulfilling my intention. The remarks which I now wish to make are summarily these. 1. All our time is God's. 2. All business is to be done for Him. 3. Everything is to be done in its season. The Sabbath has its peculiar duties, and so has the spring, the summer, the autumn, and the winter. We are just as much required to labor 6 days as we are to rest on the Sabbath. In other words, all our time is to be devoted to God. Now it often happens that in certain seasons of the year, most men have much more leisure than at other seasons. That is, God has much less for them to do with the ordinary labors in which He employs them. The farmer, and indeed as a general thing all classes, have less of the common business of life to transact in the winter than at other seasons of the year. Now it is highly reasonable and proper, and no doubt duty, at such seasons to have our time all employed in something that shall promote the glory of God and the good of His kingdom. It is proper to hold more meetings, to labor more in prayer and visitation, and in direct efforts for the conversion of sinners and the sanctification of Christians, at such seasons than at other seasons, when our duties to God plainly call us to till the ground, to gather the fruits of the field, or attend to any of the necessary business of life. To do all duties in their season affords no ground for the accusation that our religion is confined to protracted meetings, is a religion of the winter, or of leisure days, etc. By itself this affords not a particle of evidence of spasmodical and intermitting religion, any more than a man's going to church on the Sabbath and working as God commands him to do through the week is evidence that his religion on the Sabbath is selfishness. The fact is, a man may labor through the week for the same reason that he goes to meeting on the Sabbath, namely, to obey and glorify God. Nay, he must do this, or he has no religion at all. He must be just as devout and just as much consecrated to God in his business as he is in going to meeting, or as he ought to be in going to meeting, or he has no religion at all. So the farmer, merchant, or mechanic may be and is bound to be just as singly devoted to God, just as pious and holy in the labors of summer as in attending protracted meetings in the winter. The fact is, he is to do all for God, or in reality he does nothing for God, unless he acts for the same end in the one case as in the other, and unless he acts in both cases with an eye single to the glory of God, he is not a holy man at all. Now there is no certainty that a church is selfish because its members hold protracted meetings only at those seasons of the year when their duty to God, to their country, and to their families does not call them to other departments of labor. Whenever they can be spared from other departments of God's work, let them lay their hands to this. If they have any leisure time, let them then make extraordinary efforts for the conversion of sinners and the sanctification of the church. This is reasonable, this is right, and I see not how this can be neglected without sin. While then it is true and ought to be lamented that there is no doubt much spasmodical religion, or rather much that professes to be religion connected with, and sometimes growing out of protracted meetings, yet it is by no means necessarily true that real Christians have turned aside from their duty in holding protracted meetings at some seasons of the year, and at other seasons of the year being very busy in laboring with their hands, tilling their grounds, plying their trades, and serving God in their generation, in their secular employments. I wish, therefore, that it might be distinctly understood that it is very natural that revivals of religion should prevail at certain seasons of the year, when the minds of both saints and sinners are less occupied with the necessary business of life. It is very natural and very important that special efforts should be made at such seasons, and that revivals of religion should be the result of such efforts. It is therefore entirely out of place for the opposers of revivals and protracted meetings to object to them, that they seldom occur except at those seasons of the year when people have comparatively little else to do. This is as might be expected. This is in a great measure as it should be. While, therefore, I would recommend, as I did in a former letter, that sufficient effort should be made during all seasons of the year to keep religion alive in the hearts of Christians, and to make aggressive movements upon the kingdom of darkness in the conversion of sinners, I would at the same time recommend and beseech my brethren to encourage the churches to make special and extraordinary efforts at every season of the year, when time can be spared from other necessary avocations, to attend more particularly to the great work of saving souls.